I'm Renee Shaw, and welcome to Kentucky Ancestors Town Hall by the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm so glad to be here with you all, with this audience, and we have Barbara, who's with us. You've come all the way from Chicago.
Yes, I have.
So let's talk about the family mystery that you asked us to help you solve. Has to do with a man named John Drew. So first of all, tell us what his relationship is to you.
He is my great-great-grandfather. He is my grandfather's grandfather.
Okay.
So, and I never knew my grandfather, so I don't have stories passed down about his life.
Well, I know you already had some information about your ancestor, but you found it to be kind of confusing and incomplete, right?
He's kind of a brick wall.
Yes, understood. Well, one question you had was whether we could identify John's race. You also wondered whether he pastored a church, and generally just wanted to know a little bit about the world in which he lived. So Barbara, our research team, did a lot of digging, and they found some answers for you. So I know you're going to be glad to hear them, in addition to your own exploration. But for the benefit of our audience, I am going to tell parts of John's story that you already know, but just to fill in the audience about John Drew. So here's a little biographical information. John Drew was born in North Carolina around 1823 and died in Jackson County, Kentucky in 1890. We have found records that lead us to believe that he was living in Kentucky by the late 1830s. In 1851, John married Isabel McQueen in Clay County. They went on to have 14 children. 14 children. Census records list John's occupation as a farmer. Between 1851 and 1859, he purchased 175 acres in Laurel County. In 1859 and 1860, he also purchased land in Jackson County. Now, we don't think he moved. We think Jackson County lines actually formed around him. It was a new county in 1858 that took land from parts of Laurel, Madison, Estill, Owsley, Clay, and Rockcastle counties. An interesting fact about John and Isabel, or Ibby, Ibby is what she was called, is that Ibby was white, but John was not. Now, as you know, the documents that recorded John's race did so inconsistently. So that's one reason that you came to us, right? So let's look at some of them. So if you will, please remove the first cover sheet.
Okay.
Okay, so it may be a little difficult to read, but this is the census from 1860. The 1860 U.S. federal census for Jackson County identifies John's race as mulatto. Okay, and you see that it says M there, right? Census takers had instructions to leave a space blank if a person was white, to use B for black and M for mulatto, which is what M is depicted there, right? So based on census instructions for following decades, M probably meant having African ancestry. Makes sense? Yes. So now let's look at a different document with slightly different information. So if you'll turn to the next document, please.
Okay.
Okay, even more information of irregularity, perhaps. This is a regular U.S. Army service registration from 1863. You can see John's name is on it and his race, which is?
Black.
Black.
Yes.
Black. This is the only
confusion.
That's the confusion. This is the only time black appears on any of the documents that we found for John. All right, now go to the next document. Now, this is the 1870 census. Again, it lists John's race as
mulatto.
M for mulatto. But this census also records his children's race as mulatto. So there is a lot of confusing information here. Finally, in the 1880 census, we have completely new information. The document identifies John's race as Indian and his children as one-half Indian. So if you go to that next document.
Okay.
Yes. So the story, the plot thickens, right? So you asked us if we could tell you John's race. And these documents and others, like the deeds and the tax records we found, don't give us any clearer answer than what you had, but they still tell us a few things. First, John Drew was a free citizen of the United States when he lived in Kentucky. If he'd been enslaved, the 1850 federal census would not have listed him by name. Second, he was of mixed race ancestry. Because most of the documents we found indicate African American and white ancestry, we believe this is probably the case. As for the 1880 census, there may be a lot of reasons for why John and his family identified as Indian, but we believe we found one very compelling reason. We'll explain that a little bit later when we talk about John's world and talk about what his world was like.
Yeah.
Barbara, this is all we know from the paper trail, but you and your mother actually went beyond that, and you actually took DNA tests, correct?
We did.
So tell us about that.
So I did the DNA of my mom and myself and my brother and several other relatives, and we come from the west coast of Africa.
Interesting. Well, we looked at those results and saw trace amounts of African American and American Indian DNA in your mother's results. Unfortunately, the amount is too small and the number of possible sources too large for us to determine whether John Drew was the only source or if there were others. So it is disappointing not to be able to resolve this question for you, but we have extremely interesting information to share with you about John. Okay, you ready for this?
I am.
But before I tell you more, though, let's watch a video tip from Sherry Daniels, who's a member of the research team here, on what to do when documents provide conflicting information. You'll find this very informative.
Now that you've found the correct ancestor and you're busy documenting their life, what do you do with conflicting pieces of information? First of all, you need to remember that every researcher will encounter these elements of misinformation. It is what we do with them that counts. So why do we encounter wrong information? Well, these instances of information errors can happen for a number of reasons. They usually happen because someone giving the information may not have first-hand knowledge of the information and may remember it wrong when asked to repeat it. For instance, think about the information on a death certificate. In many cases, this information is one generation removed from the deceased, raising the risk for a potential information error. In some cases, the person receiving or recording the information heard it wrong, or just made a typo. One good example of this can be found on the census record. Enumerators often heard things wrong, wrote the facts wrong, or were given information by a neighbor who had no connection to the family. And worst case scenario, sometimes a gravestone can contain an error. But what do we do when we encounter these situations? According to the genealogical proof standard, we should document all pieces of information we uncover, including the errors. In doing this step, we hope to build enough evidence to soundly refute the contradiction. However, this may not always work, and indeed may point your research in another direction. But this is why the genealogical proof standard is a must for genealogists. As a 5-step research process, this guided checklist can help you tackle even the most difficult of challenges. For more information about the GPS, we have several books here in the library for you to review.
So it makes perfect sense why information can be conflicting or confusing, and Sherry did a great job of explaining that. We sometimes forget that our ancestors lived in drastically different worlds and times from ours today, and to really understand their lives, we have to learn about the time in which they lived in history.
Which in John Drew's case was the Civil War.
Yes. So when John Drew came to Kentucky in the 1830s, slavery was legal in the state. It would remain legal until December 18, 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified nationally. Abolitionist missionaries started working in Kentucky in the decades leading up to the Civil War. They had a twofold purpose. One, of course, to end slavery. The other was to convert people to Christianity. Often these missionaries came from other states like Ohio. But one of the most famous abolitionist missionaries in Kentucky was born here. Dr. Alistine Turley, director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education at Berea College, is going to tell us more.
John Gregg Fee was born into a slaveholding family in Bracken County, Kentucky, who came to Madison County in the 1850s at the behest of Cassius Marcellus Clay to help him establish anti-slavery church here in the Glades in Madison County. And his work continued as an anti-slavery educator and minister, primarily in the Appalachian South. Fee worked primarily with ministers from around the country, as well as many people in Kentucky who had been abandoned by the anti-slavery cause by the 1850s. So he worked primarily with ministers did not matter the denomination. Under Fee, the church and education were one and the same. So he did not believe you could be a Christian and not be able to read and understand the Gospels. He felt that education was part of creating a free man. So having an education allowed you to be integrated into the American society and reap the benefits of an American society. And he thought that included women, it included slaves, it included Indians, it included anyone who was seeking an education. Kentucky began with many abolitionists. By the 1850s, Fee is pretty much a lone ranger in the terms of being an abolitionist in Kentucky. He never wavers from his beginnings. So by the 1850s, when he's here in Berea, he has already gathered together all the remaining Kentucky abolitionists, and these are his cohorts. So I think it's important for people to understand that John Gregg Fee not only established Berea College, but through the assistance of the American Missionary Associations, established many schools to teach African Americans across the state and in the region, not just Berea College. And he did so because he believed in the power of education to bring together community.
John Fee was affiliated with the American Missionary Association before the Civil War. In 1855, the AMA, as it's called for short, reported that it had 3 missionaries in Kentucky. 2 of them were John Fee and George Candy. Their work included starting schools and churches in Jackson County. John Drew knew both of those men, and he supported their work. Now, I'd like you to go to the next document.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So George Candy wrote this newspaper article in 1913. He said that most people's ideas were influenced by slaveholding families, but there were some, quote, radical abolitionists in Jackson County when he arrived. Now, would you please read the highlighted area here for us?
At McKee, but few radicals there, Jack, Drew, and wife.
All right, so tell us about how you feel learning that John and Ibby were abolitionists.
I think it's amazing.
Amazing. And you probably suspected.
I suspected that they were.
Yes. So besides John and Ibby, other local people supported Candy and Fee in their work, but other folks did not welcome the abolitionist activity. When we talked with Dr. Turley, who was in the video, we learned that pro-slavery Kentuckians beat John Fee more than 27 times before they forced him to leave Kentucky in 1859. A little later, locals in Jackson County forced Candy and another missionary and a man who distributed Bibles and abolitionist materials to leave. The local people shaved the men's heads and covered them with tar.
Wow.
Now, Jackson County seems to have been more accepting of people of color than we might expect in a slave state. It had a mixed race community, and records show other mixed race couples like John and Ibby. But still, it's likely that John and other local abolitionists had to watch their backs, at least sometimes. That makes sense, right? So as we know, the United States went on to war with itself in 1861 over the issue of slavery. When other slave-holding states left the Union, Kentucky tried to remain neutral and not take sides. Within a few months, however, Kentucky's government sided with the Union. Now, that might seem like a strange thing for a slave state to do, but one factor in that decision was that many Kentuckians thought that they would be able to keep their enslaved workforce if they remained loyal to the federal government, right? Those Kentuckians felt extremely betrayed when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, freeing enslaved people in the Confederate States. They knew it was only a matter of time before the same thing would happen in Kentucky. John Drew later would experience Kentucky's backlash to emancipation.
Wow.
You might be wondering what John did during the war years. We saw earlier that he registered with the regular U.S. Army in 1863. We saw that. But he did not serve in the military. He did, though, serve his community. So if you'll go to the next document, and if you'll read the transcription there of the letter.
Dear brother, we, the undersigned, commend unto you our dearly beloved brother John Drew, as being a man of good moral, and religious character, and worthy of all praise. He has been tending the South Fork Church the last spring and summer in connection with Brother Mobley and the church and congregation generally believe him to be a worthy and useful man for the ministry.
Have you ever seen that letter before?
I never have.
How do you feel seeing that letter?
I think he's a pretty remarkable man.
Pretty remarkable man. Two white men wrote that in the middle of the Civil War, recommending that the American Missionary Association, AMA, appoint John Drew as minister to their church. Their request certainly says a lot about the way people regarded John Drew then, and don't you agree?
I agree.
Yeah. We also know that some of John's activities during the war took him out of Jackson County. After emancipation, John Fee returned to Kentucky and asked permission to set up a church for African American soldiers at Camp Nelson in Jessamine County. The Army said he could, but insisted that he also educate the soldiers. Of course, it was up to Fee to find teachers to help. Fee wrote to John Drew and asked him to come help with the school. John went, but he stayed only a month because the Army needed the school building for other purposes. Still, though, Fee asked John Drew specifically to help. So that says a lot about the kind of person your ancestor was and the regard his contemporaries had for him. You had a question about John Drew's connection to the establishment of Berea College, okay? And we have not found any, but as you can see, he definitely had a connection to its founder, John Fee, all right? So that's not all we found.
Okay.
After the war ended, the American Missionary Association continued to work in Jackson and neighboring counties, and John Drew continued to work with AMA-affiliated churches. So if you will, go to the next document. This is a report from the American Missionary Association. And would you read the pastor's name for Walnut Chapel?
John Drew, in 1871.
What do you think of that?
I think it, verifies what the letter said, that he was a deeply religious and moral man.
Yes.
To be a minister of a church.
Yes, and he was ordained as a minister in 1868, 3 years before Walnut Chapel organized in 1871. AMA reports showed that John was pastor at Walnut Chapel as late as 1880. Now, an interesting thing happened at Walnut Chapel in 1882, according to the AMA. Some of the people who attended the church had African heritage, and they found themselves caught in the Kentucky backlash to the Emancipation Proclamation. After the war, Kentucky lawmakers worked to establish separate, quote, common or public school systems for African Americans and white children. In 1874, they made it illegal for African American children to attend a, quote, white school, and for white children to attend a, quote, African American school. The AMA article said the law disturbed Walnut Chapel's harmony and utterly deprived the African American children of the opportunity to go to school because there were not enough children to organize a school district of their own, and there never would be. The AMA advised the community to start a new school that it would sponsor. Teachers came from Berea College, and because it was not a common school, anyone could attend it. We think the 1874 law segregating schools could have been the reason John's family identified as Indian in the 1880 census. John and Ibby still had several school-age children at home. All making sense now, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
Piece by piece. By the way, Walnut Chapel was not John's only church. In 1876, he led a revival at Camp Nelson Church in the Ariel community. That community had grown up after the war in the place that John Fee started his school and church during the war. John Drew became Ariel's regular pastor in 1878 and stayed until 1881. But instead of me telling you more about John's work, let's hear it from someone from his time and what they had to say about it. So if you go to the next document, please. If you will, read the transcription provided for you out loud.
Dear brother, I received your check of $50 April 25th, 1878. I have visited the church at Camp Nelson once every month and preached 4 sermons each time. The church is doing about as good as can be expected. I had one more addition my last trip. The Sabbath school is doing well. I have organized 2 Sabbath schools in Jackson, one at Walnut Chapel with 50 scholars, and one at Gravel Lick with 25 schoolers. It is doing well. The people is interested deeply in the schools. The youth is the hope of the South. Slavery and sectarianism has ruined the South, and God's word taught to the people is the only remedy to save the country. The young is anxious to enter the Sabbath school. All that is lacking is good men to go ahead and organize and teach the youth of the land. There is not much hope for the aged people. The church at Walnut Chapel is doing well. We are moving along. My quarter is up. Please send me a check for $50. Yours in Christ, John Drew.
John Drew.
John Drew.
That's his letter?
That is so cool.
That's
that really
his
is amazing.
I mean, can you describe how it feels seeing this from him?
That he valued education for the youth. That was the hope of the future at that time, and still is, that people be educated.
Yeah.
That was his mission.
Yeah, remarkable legacy. And Barbara, this is just one of several letters that we found that John Drew wrote to the AMA. Just a magical experience. And just seeing this, I know that it's emotional and overwhelming.
It is,
Yes.
because it's from Clover Bottom, which is where my grandmother was born.
Oh, wow.
Which is really cool.
It's really cool.
They live there.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I can't wait to find out how you all talk about this at the dinner table.
Yes.
A remarkable find and a remarkable story, and we're so appreciative that you asked us to help make this discovery with you. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much for providing this story of my ancestor.
Yeah,
a noble man.
A noble man indeed. I have a feeling you inherited that nobility.
I think all our Drew ancestors are.
I think on the front row, certainly they did. Thank you, Barbara. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.